The rifle barrel pressed against Wayne Long's temple felt cold as winter steel, but his eyes never left the woman standing in his doorway. Sandra Gomez clutched her swollen belly with one hand, while the other gripped a rusted kitchen knife, her dark hair wild from the prairie wind. Behind her, three men on horseback waited in the gathering dusk, their faces hidden beneath hat brims that cast shadows like death itself. "You got two choices, Long," called the man holding the gun to Wayne's head. "Hand over the woman and whatever gold you got stashed, or we put you in the ground right here on your own land." Sandra's voice cut through the tension like her blade might cut flesh. "I told you already, Zachary Wilson. I ain't going nowhere with you or your brothers. This is my home now." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with months of struggle and survival that had brought them to this moment. Wayne could see the determination in Sandra's stance, the way she positioned herself between the men in the cabin they had built together through harsh winter nights and back-breaking summer days. She had changed from the frightened woman who had stepped off the train 8 months ago, carrying nothing but a carpet bag and the child growing inside her. But to understand how they had reached this crossroads, where a pregnant woman faced down armed men to protect the life she had carved from unforgiving soil, the story must begin where it truly started. Not with gunfire and threats, but with desperation and hope arriving on the afternoon train to Copper Creek. The locomotive's whistle had echoed across the empty plains like a dying animal's cry when Sandra Gomez first set foot on the wooden platform. Her dress, once fine blue cotton, bore the stains and wrinkles of 3 days' travel from St. Louis. The carpet bag in her hands contained everything she owned in the world, which amounted to 2 spare dresses, a worn Bible, and $17 in crumpled bills. Wayne Long stood at the far end of the platform, hat in hand, studying the woman who had answered his advertisement in the Missouri Gazette. She was not what he had expected. The other mail-order brides who had come before her had been slender things, some barely out of girlhood, all of them lasting less than a month before fleeing back to whatever cities had spawned them. Sandra Gomez was different. Her body carried the obvious swell of pregnancy beneath her travel-worn dress, and her face held lines that spoke of hardship endured rather than merely witnessed. "You Wayne Long?" she asked, approaching him with steady steps despite the exhaustion that darkened the skin beneath her eyes. "I am." He replaced his hat and took her bag without asking. "Train's not due back through for 3 days. Hope you brought enough determination to last at least that long." Sandra studied his face, noting the scars that marked his hands and the way his shoulders carried themselves like a man accustomed to bearing weight alone. "I didn't come all this way to turn back at the first sign of difficulty, Mr. Long, though I suspect you've had plenty of women do exactly that." They walked toward his wagon in silence, the only sounds their footsteps on the wooden planks and the distant lowing of cattle somewhere beyond the town's single row of buildings. Copper Creek consisted of a general store, a saloon, a church that doubled as the schoolhouse, and perhaps 20 houses scattered like dice across the prairie. "The advertisement mentioned you were expecting a housekeeper and companion," Sandra said as Wayne helped her onto the wagon seat. "It didn't mention anything about previous arrangements that didn't work out." Wayne climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Didn't figure it was relevant. Past is past, far as I'm concerned. Question is whether you got the spine for what's ahead." The wagon lurched into motion, carrying them away from the town and into the vast emptiness of the territory. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by occasional stands of cottonwood trees that marked the presence of water. Sandra placed a protective hand over her belly as the child inside her stirred. "How many came before me?" she asked after they had traveled for nearly an hour without speaking. Wayne kept his eyes on the horizon. 7. Some lasted 2 weeks, some barely made it through the first night. All of them had their reasons for leaving, I suppose. And what were those reasons? Hard work, loneliness, winter cold that cuts through your bones and stays there for months. Nearest neighbor is 12 miles south and he's not much for conversation. Sandra absorbed this information while watching the sun begin its descent toward the western horizon. "What about the child I'm carrying? Your advertisement didn't specify whether you were looking for a woman with complications." Wayne glanced at her swollen middle, then back at the trail ahead. "Child needs a roof and regular meals, same as anyone else. Question is whether you can pull your weight while providing for it. The honesty in his voice surprised her. She had expected judgment, perhaps disgust, certainly questions about the father and circumstances that had led to her condition. Instead, Wayne Long spoke of practical matters with the same tone he might use to discuss the weather or the price of grain. As they traveled deeper into the territory, Sandra began to understand why the previous women had fled. The isolation was absolute, the silence so complete that it seemed to press against her eardrums like physical weight. When Wayne finally pointed toward a cluster of buildings in the distance and announced they had reached his homestead, Sandra felt relief and trepidation. The house was larger than she had expected, built from logs that had been chinked with mud and prairie grass. A barn stood nearby, along with a chicken coop and what appeared to be a workshop. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that someone had been maintaining the fire in their absence. "Thomas Smith looks after the place when I'm away," Wayne explained. "He's got a cabin about a mile north. Good man, keeps to himself mostly." They pulled up in front of the house just as a tall, lean figure emerged from the barn. Thomas Smith moved with the careful gait of a man who had spent years in the saddle, his weathered face breaking into a slight smile when he saw Wayne. "Train was on time for once," Thomas observed, touching the brim of his hat in Sandra's direction. "Ma'am." "Thomas, this is Sandra Gomez. Sandra, Thomas Smith. He helps with the cattle and keeps an eye on things." Inside, the house revealed itself to be spartanly furnished but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, with a kitchen area occupying the opposite corner. Two doors led to what Sandra assumed were bedrooms, and a ladder provided access to a loft space beneath the peaked roof. "You can have the back bedroom," Wayne said, setting her bag beside one of the doors. "I'll take the loft. Thomas usually eats supper with us when he's around, if that suits you." When she returned to the main room, she found Wayne and Thomas seated at a rough wooden table, bowls of stew steaming before them. A third bowl waited at the empty chair, along with a chunk of bread that looked homemade. "Thomas baked the bread," Wayne said, noticing her surprised expression. "Man's got skills that come in handy out here." After supper, Thomas excused himself and headed back toward his own cabin, leaving Wayne and Sandra alone for the first time since her arrival. "I should probably explain about the child," Sandra said finally, her hands folded protectively over her belly. Wayne poured himself another cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. "Not unless you want to. Past is past, like I said before. The father was a merchant in St. Louis. Married man, though he neglected to mention that detail until after I found myself in this condition. His wife discovered our arrangement and made it clear that I was no longer welcome in the city." Wayne nodded as if she had told him nothing more significant than the day's temperature. "Man who abandons his responsibilities isn't worth the worry. Child will be better off without that kind of influence." The matter-of-fact acceptance in his voice brought unexpected tears to Sandra's eyes. She had prepared herself for shame and judgment, for the kind of moral condemnation that had driven her from St. Louis. Instead, Wayne Long offered something she had not dared hope for: simple acceptance of her circumstances without demands for explanation or penance. "The other women who came before me," Sandra said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "What happened to them exactly?" Wayne settled back in his chair, coffee cup cradled between his palms. "First one was Kelly Allen, came from Chicago. Lasted 2 weeks before she decided the isolation was too much. Second was Andrea Morris from Denver. Made it almost 3 weeks before Zachary Wilson and his brother showed up looking for trouble. Scared her so bad she packed up that very night." "Who is Zachary Wilson?" "Local troublemaker with delusions of importance. Him and his brothers think they run this territory. They've been trying to buy out the smaller homesteaders for years, using intimidation when money doesn't work." Sandra absorbed this information with growing unease. "And they bothered the other women who came here?" "Every single one. Soon as word gets around that there's a new woman at my place, they show up with their threats and insinuations. Most of the women couldn't handle the pressure." Wayne stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening prairie. "My land sits right in the middle of what they consider their territory. They've managed to buy out or scare off most of the other small holders, but I've refused every offer they have made. And you think they'll come for me, too?" "I know they will. Question is whether you've got the backbone to stand up to them when they do." Sandra joined him at the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. I didn't come all this way to be frightened off by bullies, but I need to know what I'm facing. Wayne turned to study her face in the lamplight. They'll start with talk, trying to convince you that staying here isn't safe. When that doesn't work, they'll escalate. They've never actually hurt anyone directly, but they've made it clear they're willing to cross that line if necessary. The next morning brought Sandra's first real taste of life on Wayne's homestead. She woke before dawn to the sound of cattle lowing in the distance and the creak of boots on wooden floors as Wayne prepared for his daily chores. By the time she had dressed and made her way to the kitchen, he had already started a fire in the stove and put coffee on to boil. Figured you might want to sleep in after the long journey, he said without looking up from the eggs he was frying. But if you're planning to stay, you'll need to get used to early mornings. Sandra accepted a cup of coffee and watched him work. What needs doing around here? Chickens need feeding and watering. Garden needs tending, though there's not much left this late in the season. Laundry piles up quick when you're working with cattle all day. He glanced at her swollen belly. How much longer before the baby comes? 2 months, maybe 3. It's hard to say exactly. Wayne nodded and slid eggs onto 2 plates. We'll need to make arrangements with the doctor in town when the time comes. They spent the morning working together, Sandra learning the routines that govern daily life on the homestead. The chickens needed fresh water and scattered grain. The vegetable garden, though mostly harvested, still produced late tomatoes and winter squash that needed picking. By midday, she was exhausted but oddly satisfied. The work was hard, but it produced visible results. You did good work this morning, Wayne said over their simple lunch. Most of the others complained about the labor before they'd even tried it. That afternoon brought their first visitors. Sandra was hanging the last of the laundry when she heard horses approaching from the south. Wayne emerged from the barn, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip, and Thomas appeared from the direction of his cabin, rifle cradled in his arms. 3 men rode into the yard, their horses well-groomed and their clothes cleaner than those of most working ranchers. The leader was a man in his 30s with pale eyes and a carefully trimmed beard. Wayne Long, the leader called, remaining mounted. Heard you had yourself another visitor. Zachary Wilson, Wayne replied evenly. Sandra, these are the neighbors I told you about. Sandra stepped closer to the house, instinctively putting distance between herself and the mounted men. Ma'am, Zachary Wilson touched his hat brim in a mockery of politeness. I'm afraid Wayne here hasn't been entirely honest with you about the situation in these parts. How so? Sandra kept her voice steady despite the fear that made her heart race. This territory can be dangerous for a woman, especially one in your delicate condition. We've had trouble with rustlers and claim jumpers, men who wouldn't hesitate to harm innocent folks to get what they want. Wayne stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Sandra and the mounted men. Funny thing about that trouble, Zachary, seems to follow you and your brothers wherever you go. Zachary's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened. Now that's not a very neighborly attitude, Wayne says. We're just trying to look out for the lady's welfare. I appreciate your concern, Sandra said, moving to stand beside Wayne, but I'm perfectly capable of looking after myself. Thomas shifted his position slightly, the rifle in his hands becoming more prominent. I think you boys have said your piece. Time to move along. Zachary Wilson's gaze moved between Wayne, Sandra, and Thomas, calculating odds and possibilities. We'll be seeing you around, Mrs. Gomez. Hope you make better choices than your predecessors. They wheeled their horses and rode away, leaving clouds of dust and an atmosphere thick with unspoken threats. That was them? Sandra asked. That was them, Wayne confirmed. And that was just the opening move. They'll be back. That evening, Sandra learned more about the campaign of intimidation that had driven away the previous women. Kelly Allen had found dead chickens scattered around her bedroom window. Andrea Morris had discovered her clothes slashed to ribbons while she slept. They never do anything that can be directly traced back to them, Thomas explained. Always make sure they have alibis. Always make it look like coincidence. Sandra listened to their stories with growing anger rather than fear. She had faced down moral condemnation and social ostracism in St. Louis. She would not be frightened away by bullies who hid behind masks of false respectability. What would it take to stop them permanently, she asked. Wayne and Thomas exchanged glances. Catching them in the act of something the law can't ignore, Wayne said finally. How do we do that? By showing them you're not going anywhere, Thomas said. By proving you're tougher than the others were. Sandra placed her hands on her swollen belly, feeling the child move restlessly inside her. Then that's what we'll do. The harassment began in earnest 3 days later. Sandra woke to find the chicken coop door standing open, the birds scattered across the yard and 2 of them missing entirely. Wayne examined the latch and found clear evidence that it had been deliberately opened. They're testing you, he said as they rounded up the surviving chickens, seeing how you react to small provocations. Sandra's reaction was to reinforce the coop with additional latches and to begin carrying a heavy stick whenever she went to tend the birds. The next incident involved their water supply. Sandra discovered the well rope had been cut, dropping the bucket into the depths where it couldn't be easily retrieved. Replacing it required lowering Thomas into the well on a new rope, a dangerous operation that took most of the morning. They're escalating, Wayne observed, testing how much inconvenience you are willing to tolerate. A week later, Sandra woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of crackling flames. The barn was on fire, orange light dancing against the night sky. Wayne and Thomas were already outside with buckets, forming a chain from the well to the burning structure. Sandra joined them without hesitation, ignoring Wayne's protests about her condition. The 3 of them worked frantically through the night, pouring water on the flames and beating down sparks. By dawn, they had saved the structure, though the roof was badly damaged. This time they went too far, Wayne said, examining the charred remains of what had obviously been an intentionally set fire. This is destruction of property, something the sheriff can't ignore. But when they rode to town to report the incident, they found Sheriff Benjamin Scott sympathetic but helpless. I believe you about who did it, he said, but I need proof, evidence, witnesses who saw them actually setting the fire. The ride back to the homestead was conducted in grim silence. That evening, as they sat around the table planning repairs to the barn, Sandra made a decision that would change everything. I'm not leaving, she announced suddenly. I don't care what they do next. I'm not going anywhere. Wayne looked up from the sketches he had been making. Sandra, you don't understand what you're saying. They've escalated to arson. Next time it might be the house, with you inside it. Then we make sure there isn't a next time. How do we do that? Sandra stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the damaged barn. By giving them what they want, but not in the way they expect. They want me gone because they think I'm weak, like the others were. What if instead of running, I dig in deeper? What if I make it clear that this is my home now, permanently? Wayne shook his head. That's exactly what I've been doing for years, and it hasn't stopped them. But you're alone. You're 1 man against 3. What if they had to deal with both of us, working together? The idea hung in the air between them, radical in its simplicity. It would mean marriage, Wayne said quietly. Real marriage, not just the arrangement we talked about in letters. I know. Thomas cleared his throat. If you 2 are married, legally married, then Sandra has rights to this property that she wouldn't have otherwise. If something happened to Wayne, she couldn't just be driven off. Wayne studied Sandra's face in the lamplight. Is that what you want? To be tied to this place? And to me, permanently? Sandra placed her hands on her belly, feeling the child stir. I want my baby to have a home. A real home, with people who care about its welfare. I want to belong somewhere. The preacher comes through town once a month, Wayne said finally. He's due back next week. Sandra felt a flutter of hope or fear. Are you saying yes? I'm saying we should both think about it carefully. But Sandra could see the decision forming in his eyes. Wayne Long was a man who had spent years fighting alone. The prospect of true partnership was more appealing than he wanted to admit. The Wilson brothers returned 2 days later, riding up to the house with casual arrogance. Sandra was in the garden when Zachary Wilson called from his saddle. Mrs. Gomez, terrible shame about the fire. These accidents can be so dangerous. Sandra straightened slowly, a winter squash cradled in her arms. Mr. Wilson, I wasn't expecting visitors. We were in the neighborhood and thought we'd check on your welfare. Word around town is that you're planning to make this arrangement permanent. Word travels fast in small communities. Zachary dismounted and walked closer. It does indeed, and that concerns us, frankly. A woman in your condition shouldn't be making hasty decisions about her future. Wayne's hammer blows ceased from the roof above, and Sandra could sense him listening. Thomas emerged from the barn, positioning himself where he could intervene if necessary. I appreciate your concern, Sandra said, but my decisions are my own to make. Are they, though? Benjamin Wilson spoke from his horse. Seems to me a woman who finds herself in your circumstances doesn't have many choices. Sandra looked up sharply. What reputation would that be? Didn't he tell you about the others, about what happened to them? Anthony Rodriguez joined the conversation, about how they all left in the middle of the night, some of them crying, some of them too scared to even pack their belongings. I know about the previous women, Sandra said evenly. I also know why they left. The lies fell between them like poison, each word carefully chosen to plant seeds of doubt and fear. Sandra could see the calculation behind Zachary's approach. Mr. Wilson, I've been wondering about something myself, Sandra said. What's that? I've been wondering why 3 grown men spend so much time worrying about the welfare of women they've never met. I've been wondering why you care so much about my personal decisions. Zachary's smile faltered. We're just being neighborly. Are you? Because it seems to me that truly neighborly folks would have offered to help repair the barn after the fire. Instead, you come here spreading gossip and making veiled threats. Now see here, lady. Benjamin Wilson shifted in his saddle. No, you see here. Sandra's voice carried steel that surprised even her. I don't know what game you 3 are playing, but I'm not interested in participating. This is my home now, and I'll thank you to respect that fact. Zachary's mask of false concern slipped entirely. Your home? You've been here less than 2 weeks. The same thing that gives any person a claim to their home. I work here, I contribute here, I belong here. More importantly, I choose to be here, despite the efforts of certain individuals to make me feel unwelcome. Wayne chose that moment to climb down from the roof, his hammer still in his hand and his face dark with anger. Gentlemen, he said, the word carrying no warmth whatsoever, I believe the lady has made her position clear. Zachary looked between Wayne and Sandra, calculating odds. This isn't over long. The Wilson brothers remounted and rode away, their parting words carrying a promise of future trouble. How much of what they said was true? Sandra asked when they were gone. Wayne set down his hammer and looked her in the eye. None of it. Kelly Allen left because she couldn't handle the isolation. Andrea Morris was frightened by their threats, not by anything I did. That evening, Sandra made her final decision about marriage. Not because of fear, not because of limited options, but because she had found something worth fighting for. I want to marry you, she told Wayne as they sat by the fire after dinner. Not because I'm desperate or frightened, but because I choose to. Because I want to be part of what you're building here. Wayne studied her face in the firelight, even knowing what it might cost, especially knowing that. Some things are worth fighting for, Wayne. This place, this life, the future we could build together. Thomas looked up from his whittling. Preachers due in town day after tomorrow. Wayne reached across and took Sandra's hand. Are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back. Sandra squeezed his fingers, feeling the calluses that spoke of years of hard work. I'm sure. The wedding took place on a Thursday morning in the small church that served Copper Creek. Sandra wore her best dress, the blue cotton she had arrived in, carefully cleaned and pressed. Wayne had purchased a new shirt from the general store, and Thomas served as witness along with the storekeeper and his wife. The ceremony was simple but dignified. The words were traditional, the promises ancient, but the circumstances were anything but ordinary. Sandra spoke her vows with the weight of pregnancy making her backache and the knowledge that armed men might be watching from the hills. Do you, Sandra Gomez, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do. Do you, Wayne Long, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. The kiss that sealed their union was brief and formal, but Sandra felt something shift inside her. She was no longer Sandra Gomez, mail-order bride of questionable reputation. She was Sandra Long, wife and partner, with legal rights that no one could easily strip away. They returned to the homestead as husband and wife, the legal documents safely filed at the courthouse. Sandra felt relief and apprehension as they approached the familiar buildings. This was truly her home now, but that also meant she had nowhere else to run if things went badly. The Wilson brothers were waiting for them, and they sat their horses in the yard like a tribunal, their faces grim and their hands resting on their weapons. Zachary Wilson held a piece of paper in his left hand. "Congratulations on your nuptials," Zachary called as Wayne helped Sandra down from the wagon. "Though I'm afraid the timing is unfortunate." "How so?" Wayne kept his voice level. "Sheriff's been asking uncomfortable questions about that fire. Seems someone's been spreading tales about our whereabouts that night." Zachary held up the paper. "This here's a warrant for our arrest, issued this morning." Sandra felt her heart sink. If the Wilson brothers were facing arrest, they had nothing left to lose. "Then I suggest you surrender yourselves to the proper authorities," Wayne said. Benjamin Wilson laughed harshly. "Oh, we intend to. But first, we thought we'd settle our business here once and for all." Thomas emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. "You've got one chance to walk away from this," Wayne said. "Surrender to the sheriff, serve your time, start fresh when you get out." "Start fresh?" Anthony Rodriguez spat in the dirt. "We've spent years building our position in this territory. You think we're going to let one stubborn homesteader and his pregnant whore destroy everything we've worked for?" The insult hit Sandra like a physical blow, but it also ignited something fierce inside her. She had endured moral condemnation and social ostracism, had traveled across half a continent to find a place where she could belong. No one would take that away from her. "Get down off those horses and say that to my face," she called out, stepping forward despite Wayne's restraining hand. Zachary Wilson's eyebrows rose in surprise. "What did you say?" "You heard me. If you've got something to say about me, say it like a man instead of hiding behind your horse and your brothers." The three men exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this response from a pregnant woman who should have been cowering in fear. "Sandra," Wayne said quietly, "don't give them an excuse." But Sandra was beyond caring about excuses. These men had terrorized 7 women before her, had driven them away from the only security they had found. Someone needed to stand up to them. "I'm not giving them anything they weren't already planning to take," she said. "These cowards have been hiding behind masks and alibis for years, too scared to face their victims directly." Zachary Wilson dismounted, his face flushed with anger. "You want to see how scared I am, lady? I want to see you try to intimidate someone who isn't afraid of you." The confrontation escalated quickly. Zachary advanced towards Sandra with his hand on his gun, his brothers moving to flank Wayne and Thomas. The yard became a battlefield of raised voices and drawn weapons. The first shot came from Benjamin Wilson's pistol, aimed over Sandra's head, but close enough to make her ears ring. Wayne's response was immediate and accurate, his bullet taking Benjamin in the shoulder and spinning him out of his saddle. Thomas engaged Anthony Rodriguez while Sandra dove for cover behind the wagon, her hands protecting her belly as bullets whined through the air. The battle was brief but vicious, years of accumulated tension exploding into violence. When the gun smoke cleared, Anthony Rodriguez lay motionless in the dirt, Thomas standing over him with blood seeping from a graze on his arm. Benjamin Wilson sat propped against a fence post, clutching his wounded shoulder. Zachary Wilson knelt in the middle of the yard with his hands raised. "It's over," Wayne said, breathing hard but uninjured. "Sandra, are you hurt?" Sandra emerged from behind the wagon, shaken but unharmed. "I'm fine, the baby's fine." Sheriff Benjamin Scott arrived an hour later, drawn by the sound of gunfire. He surveyed the scene with professional detachment, taking statements and examining the evidence. "Self-defense," he concluded. "Clear case of it, from what I can see." Zachary Wilson was arrested on charges of arson, intimidation, and attempted murder. Benjamin Wilson would face the same charges once his wounds healed. Anthony Rodriguez required no legal proceedings. The weeks following the gunfight brought a peace to the homestead that Sandra had not dared hope for. With the Wilson brothers gone, the campaign of intimidation came to an end. The community's attitude toward Wayne and Sandra shifted from suspicious tolerance to grudging respect. Sandra threw herself into the work of making the homestead truly her own. She expanded the vegetable garden, planting crops for the following spring. She learned to milk the cow Wayne purchased from a neighbor. Most importantly, she began preparing for the birth of her child. Wayne proved to be a different man in peacetime. Without the constant threat of harassment, he relaxed enough to reveal a dry sense of humor and genuine affection for the woman who had chosen to share his life. He built a cradle from oak wood, carving it with careful attention to detail. "Child won't need this for a few months yet," he said, running his hand over the smooth surface. "But it seems like the kind of thing that should be ready ahead of time." Sandra traced the carved designs with her fingertip. "It's beautiful. The baby will be lucky to have something so well made." The baby chose to arrive on a cold December night, 3 weeks earlier than expected. Sandra woke to cramping pains and the unmistakable sensation of labor beginning. Wayne rode through the darkness to fetch the doctor while Thomas stayed with Sandra, boiling water and gathering clean cloths. The doctor arrived just as dawn painted the eastern sky. The labor was long and difficult, complicated by the baby's early arrival and Sandra's exhaustion from months of stress. She gripped Wayne's hand through the worst contractions, drawing strength from his steady presence. "I can see the head," the doctor announced. "One more push should do it." Sandra gathered her remaining strength and bore down with everything she had left, feeling the baby slip free in a rush of relief. The first cry was strong and indignant, filling the cabin with the sound of new life. "It's a girl," the doctor said, lifting the tiny form. "Small but healthy, good color, strong lungs." Wayne cut the cord with trembling hands. When the doctor placed the cleaned and wrapped baby in Sandra's arms, Wayne reached out to touch the tiny fingers. "She's perfect," he whispered. Sandra looked down at her daughter's face, seeing features that were uniquely her own. "What should we name her?" "Whatever you want. She's your daughter." "She's our daughter," Sandra corrected gently, "and I think she should have a name that reflects where she belongs." They named her Hope for the future they were building together. Hope Long, daughter of Sandra and Wayne Long, born on a homestead carved from prairie wilderness by people who refused to be driven away. The first year of Hope's life passed with the measured rhythm of seasons changing. Sandra learned to balance motherhood with the work required to maintain their homestead, often carrying the baby in a sling while she tended the garden. Wayne proved to be a devoted father, spending evenings carving toys and telling stories. Thomas became Hope's unofficial uncle, teaching her to recognize animal sounds and showing her how flowers grew from seeds. His presence provided continuity and stability. The community's acceptance of the Long family grew stronger as it became clear that they were permanent residents. Sandra joined the church ladies' auxiliary, contributing preserves to church suppers. Wayne served on the school board, but the most significant change came in Sandra herself. The frightened woman who had stepped off the train had been replaced by someone confident in her own worth and secure in her place in the world. She no longer flinched when strangers looked at her, no longer felt the need to explain her circumstances. When a traveling preacher arrived spreading gossip about fallen women and bastard children, Sandra confronted him directly after his Sunday sermon. "Reverend," she said, standing in the church aisle with Hope in her arms, "I couldn't help but notice that your sermon focused heavily on judgment and condemnation. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on forgiveness and redemption." The preacher looked down at her with obvious distaste. "The Bible is quite clear about the consequences of sin, madam." "I see. And what about the parable of the woman taken in adultery? What did Jesus say to those who would have stoned her?" The congregation listened in tense silence as Sandra and the preacher faced off. "Are you presuming to lecture me on theology, madam?" the preacher asked. "I'm presuming to point out that a man of God might want to focus on love and compassion rather than condemnation and judgment." Several members of the congregation began to applaud. The sound spread throughout the church until nearly everyone was showing their approval for Sandra's words. The visiting preacher left town that afternoon, his mission unsuccessful in the face of a community that had learned to value courage over conventional respectability. That evening, Wayne expressed his admiration for how she had handled the confrontation. "You've changed," he said. "When you first arrived, you would have let that man's words cut you to pieces. Today you stood up to him like you were born to it." Sandra looked down at Hope's peaceful face. "I had to change. Hope deserves a mother who isn't ashamed of her past or afraid of her future." "And what about you? What do you deserve?" The question forced her to consider something she had rarely allowed herself to contemplate. "I deserve the life I've built here, the respect I've earned, the love I've found, the family I've created. I deserve to be happy. Wayne nodded, understanding the significance of her words. For Sandra to claim happiness as something she deserved represented a fundamental shift in how she saw herself. As winter gave way to spring and hope took her first steps, Sandra found herself thinking about the 7 women who had come before her. The difference, she realized, was not that she was braver or stronger. The difference was that she had found something worth fighting for that went beyond her own immediate comfort. Once Sandra decided that she did belong and that her claim was as valid as anyone, else's, the Wilson brothers, had lost their power over her. They could still threaten and intimidate, but they could not make her believe that she was unworthy of the life she had chosen. 2 years after Hope's birth, Sandra received a letter that forced her to confront the past she had left behind. The envelope was addressed in handwriting she recognized, though she had not seen it for over 3 years. Inside, she found a single sheet covered with the familiar script of her former lover. "My dear Sandra," the letter began, "I have recently learned of your circumstances through mutual acquaintances. I understand that you have married and established yourself in a homestead situation. I also understand that you have given birth to a child who may be mine." Sandra's hands trembled as she read, memories flooding back of the man who had promised her so much and delivered so little. "I am writing to inform you that my wife has recently passed away after a long illness. Her death has freed me to consider arrangements that were previously impossible. If the child is indeed mine, I am prepared to offer support and perhaps more permanent solutions to your current situation." The letter went on to describe his improved financial circumstances and his willingness to do right by Sandra and the child, provided certain conditions were met. Sandra read the letter 3 times before setting it aside and walking to the window. In the yard, Hope played with a wooden horse Thomas had carved for her. Wayne was repairing a section of fence damaged by winter storms. The life described in the letter seemed like something from another world. The man who had written it clearly expected Sandra to be grateful for his belated offer of respectability, to jump at the chance to escape her current circumstances. He had no understanding of what she had built here, no comprehension of the woman she had become. "Bad news?" Wayne asked, entering the cabin and noticing the letter. Sandra turned from the window, her decision already made. "News from my past, nothing that concerns our future." Wayne picked up the letter and read it quickly, his expression growing darker with each paragraph. "He's offering you everything you originally came west to find. Respectability, security, a father for Hope who can provide advantages I never could. Is that what you think I want? I think you deserve to consider all your options." Sandra moved to stand directly in front of her husband, taking his hands in hers. "Wayne Long, do you honestly believe that I would trade the life we've built together for anything that man could offer? I believe you should think about what's best for Hope." "I am thinking about what's best for Hope. Do you know what's best for her? Growing up with parents who love each other, in a community where she's known and valued, surrounded by people who will teach her that courage and integrity matter more than social position." Wayne searched her face, looking for signs of doubt. "You're sure, you're absolutely certain that this is the life you want?" Sandra answered by walking to the fireplace and dropping the letter into the flames. They watched it burn together, the paper curling and blackening until nothing remained but ash. "That's my answer," Sandra said, "to him and to anyone else who thinks I don't know my own mind." The next morning brought news that put the letter into proper perspective. Thomas arrived with the word that a family of homesteaders had been burned out by a prairie fire, losing everything except the clothes on their backs. Without hesitation, Sandra began gathering supplies: food, clothing, blankets. Wayne hitched up the wagon while Thomas rounded up tools and building materials. They spent the next 3 days helping the Johnson family rebuild their lives, working alongside neighbors who had responded with characteristic frontier generosity. Sandra found herself coordinating the relief effort, organizing donations, and ensuring that immediate needs were met. "You've got a gift for this," Wayne observed as they drove home. "Bringing people together, getting things organized." Sandra bounced Hope on her lap. "It feels good to be needed, to know that what I do matters to other people." "It matters to me," Wayne said quietly. "Everything you do matters to me." The letter from St. Louis proved to be the last echo of Sandra's former life. No further correspondence arrived, and she gradually stopped expecting familiar handwriting among the mail. The merchant had apparently accepted her silence as a final answer. Sandra found that she rarely thought about him anymore, except when Hope did something that reminded her of the complex genetics that had created her daughter. The child had inherited her mother's dark hair and stubborn chin, but her eyes held flecks of gold that must have come from her biological father. Those concerns multiplied as Hope grew from toddler to small child, developing a personality that combined Sandra's determination with Wayne's quiet thoughtfulness. She was curious about everything, fearless in her exploration, and possessed of an uncanny ability to find trouble. "She's going to need schooling soon," Wayne observed one evening. "There's talk of hiring a proper teacher for the area." Sandra had been thinking about the same issue. What kind of teacher? Someone from back east who might not understand frontier life? Maybe someone like us. Someone who chose this life deliberately and understands what children need to know to survive here. That autumn brought unexpected visitors, a young couple traveling west in search of land to claim. They had heard about the Long family through mutual acquaintances, had been told that Wayne and Sandra might offer advice about establishing a homestead. "We're the Washingtons," the man introduced himself and his wife, "Benjamin and Kelly Washington from Ohio." Sandra invited them to stay for dinner, curious about their story. During the meal, she learned that they had been married for 2 years, but had struggled to find opportunities in Ohio's crowded agricultural areas. "Everyone said we should go west," Kelly Washington explained. "Said there was land available for people willing to work hard and take risks." "There is," Wayne confirmed. "Question is whether you're prepared for what that work entails." Sandra told them about the first winter, when they had lived in a dugout shelter while Wayne built their cabin. She described the challenges of establishing a garden in uncultivated soil, of protecting livestock from predators, of dealing with isolation. "It sounds difficult," Kelly Washington said, "but also fulfilling, like you've created something that's entirely your own." "That's exactly what it is," Sandra replied. "The hardest and most rewarding thing I've ever done." The Washingtons stayed for 3 days, learning about local conditions. On their final evening, Kelly Washington asked the question Sandra had been expecting. "How did you know? How did you know this was the right choice?" Sandra considered her answer carefully. "I didn't know. When I first arrived, I was running away from one life without any clear idea of what the next one would look like. I stayed because leaving seemed harder than staying, and then I stayed because I found something worth fighting for." "What was that?" "The chance to become the person I was meant to be. Back east, I was defined by my mistakes, my circumstances, other people's expectations. Here, I could define myself by my choices, my actions, my contributions to something larger than my own problems." Wayne reached over and took her hand. "She saved my life as much as I saved hers. Maybe more." The Washingtons left the next morning with directions to promising land about 20 miles south. Sandra watched their wagon disappear, remembering her own arrival and the uncertainty that had accompanied those first steps toward a new life. "Think they'll make it?" Wayne asked. "They'll make it. They have what it takes: determination, realistic expectations, and each other." That winter was harsh, with temperatures far below zero and snow that drifted higher than the cabin windows. Sandra and Wayne worked together to keep their family and livestock alive through months of bitter cold, taking turns maintaining the fires that meant the difference between life and death. Hope thrived despite the difficult conditions, her energy undaunted by the need to stay indoors. She learned to read from Wayne's books, practiced writing by copying passages from Sandra's Bible, and developed an impressive vocabulary through constant conversation. "She's ready for formal schooling," Sandra announced one evening, watching Hope work through a simple arithmetic problem. "She's already beyond what I can teach her at home." Wayne looked up from the harness he was repairing. "The school board met last week. They've hired a teacher for next fall, a young woman from Kansas with proper credentials." "What's she like?" "Smart, dedicated, understands frontier life. Her name is Andrea Morris, and she's looking forward to the challenge." Sandra felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter weather. "Andrea Morris, are you certain of that name?" "Positive. Why? Do you know her?" Sandra's mind raced back to Wayne's stories about the previous mail-order brides. Andrea Morris had been one of them. the woman from Denver who had lasted almost 3 weeks before the Wilson brothers' intimidation had driven her away. Wayne, Sandra said carefully, Andrea Morris was one of the women who came here before me, one of the ones who left. The realization that Andrea Morris was returning as the new school teacher created tension that persisted through the remaining weeks of winter. Sandra wondered what had motivated the other woman's decision to come back. What had changed that made her willing to face the challenges she had once fled? Wayne approached the situation practically. She's qualified for the job, and the children need education. Whatever happened between us in the past doesn't change that fact. But what if she's still the same person who ran away at the first sign of trouble? Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But people can change, Sandra. You're not the same person who stepped off the train 4 years ago. Spring arrived early, melting the snow and revealing a landscape transformed by winter. Sandra threw herself into preparing her garden, grateful for physical labor that helped distract her from worries about the coming school year. Hope helped with the planting, her small hands carefully placing seeds in the furrows Wayne had carved. At 4 years old, she was already showing signs of practical intelligence, asking thoughtful questions about why certain crops were planted at specific times. The first meeting with Andrea Morris took place in late spring, when the new teacher arrived to examine the schoolhouse and meet with parents. Sandra attended reluctantly, curious but apprehensive. Andrea Morris had changed dramatically from the frightened creature who had fled Wayne's homestead 3 years earlier. She carried herself with confidence now, her clothing practical but well-made, her manner professional but warm. I believe in practical education, Andrea explained to the assembled parents. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are essential, but so are the skills children need to thrive in this environment. After the meeting, Andrea approached Sandra directly. Mrs. Long, she said, I was hoping we could speak privately. They walked to a quiet corner of the churchyard. I owe you an explanation, Andrea began, about why I left your husband's homestead and why I've come back to this territory. You don't owe me anything, Sandra replied carefully. I want you to understand that my leaving had nothing to do with Wayne personally. He was a perfect gentleman. I left because I was afraid and because I wasn't ready for the challenges of frontier life. Sandra studied the other woman's face. What changed? What made you ready now? Andrea smiled, and Sandra could see genuine warmth in her expression. I spent 2 years teaching in Kansas, working with children whose families had faced many of the same challenges you face here. I learned that running away from difficulty doesn't solve anything. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering Andrea's qualifications and her understanding of frontier children's needs. By the end, Sandra felt cautiously optimistic about Hope's educational prospects. The school year began in September with 14 students. Hope was among the youngest, but her advanced reading skills quickly established her as one of Andrea's most promising pupils. Sandra visited regularly, both to check on Hope's progress and to assist with projects. She found herself developing a genuine friendship with Andrea Morris, based on mutual respect and shared commitment to the children's welfare. Hope is exceptional, Andrea reported during one visit. Not just intelligent, but wise beyond her years. She has natural leadership abilities. As autumn progressed into winter, Sandra realized that her fears about Andrea Morris had been unfounded. The former mail-order bride had transformed herself into an excellent teacher, bringing out the best in her students while maintaining necessary discipline. More importantly, Andrea's presence provided living proof that people could overcome their past mistakes. Her success inspired other women to pursue their own goals, creating a ripple effect of positive change throughout the territory. The full circle of Sandra's journey became clear. One snowy December evening when Andrea joined the Long family for dinner. As they sat around the table sharing stories and laughter, Sandra reflected on the path that had brought them all to this moment. She had arrived as a desperate woman fleeing shame and seeking refuge. Andrea had come seeking the same thing, but had lacked the courage to stay and fight. Now they were both established members of the community, contributing their skills to the collective welfare of their neighbors. Hope fell asleep in Wayne's lap as the evening wound down, her small body relaxed and secure. Looking at her daughter's peaceful face, Sandra felt profound gratitude for the choices that had led to this life. Thank you, she said quietly to Wayne as he carried Hope to her bed. For what? for giving me the chance to become who I was meant to be, for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. Wayne kissed her forehead gently. Thank you for staying. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for showing me that some things are worth any risk. Outside, the prairie wind howled across the endless grassland, carrying snow and promises of spring's return. Inside the cabin Sandra and Wayne had built together, their family slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they belonged to each other and to the land they had claimed through courage, determination, and love. The mail-order bride who had survived when 7 others had fled was no longer running from anything. She had found her place, planted her roots, and created a legacy that would endure. Sandra Long had not just survived her first month or her first year. She had thrived, building something permanent and meaningful from the raw materials of hope and determination.